Well, it's unbelievable, is it? We've heard nothing from our neoliberal friends, the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation crowd for weeks. But now that they can actually see that there's going to be an end to the COVID-19 crisis, they've come out in droves. It reminds me of that little cartoon I saw once. There's a dinosaur looking at a meteorite which is coming straight for it, and there are these little mammals scurrying around the dinosaur's feet. We know what happened is the dinosaurs died, and the mammals now populate the earth, which is you and me. So it's interesting to see that they've come out of the woodworks, and we've even seen Governor Lowe, the governor of the Reserve Bank, Philip Rowe, come out and actually put forward the agenda that the federal government will be following in the next few months. And it's quite frightening, because they think the way out of the economic disaster which we are all facing at the end of the COVID-19 crisis can only be resolved by going back to neoliberal basic principles. And to hear the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia talk about deregulation, which means taking away all those rules which protect you and me and our friends and families and children in the workplace, talk about workplace flexibility, which is a fancy word for saying let's destroy what's left of the trade union movement in this country, and re-education in terms of changing people's skill set to face a new environment, which I think makes sense. And at the same time, we see the Business Council and other neoliberal based organisations, including the Murdoch media and to a lesser degree the government guild at ABC, come out supporting these ideas, including tax reform, which is based on increasing the goods and services tax from 10% to 15%, possibly 18%. So instead of concentrating on those who hold wealth in our country, the people who are going to pay the economic cost for the COVID-19 crisis are going to be 30% of Australians on social security benefits, and the 40 to 50% of Australians who earn less than about $1,500 a week, who are not in a position to take advantage of this country's investment-friendly laws. So the chessboard has been set out. That's what they want, and that's what will happen unless people like you and me come together to resist this program and put forward an alternative program. I'm not talking about revolution, I'm talking about constitutional reform. Reform which can occur under our constitutional framework. Reform which can come through Parliament. And that's why I'm here as the registered officer of a public interest before corporate interests, to discuss these issues with you. Now, I've been very pleased with the response which we've had over the last 2 or 3 weeks regarding our membership drive to increase our membership to 550 people on the Australian electoral roll, so we can apply for registration by the end of September this year. And that's registration as a federal political party. We currently have 420 members on the Australian federal roll. We need another 130, and I'm pretty confident we will get that, because I am sure you do not want to see the agenda which has caused so much harm in the world be reinforced, because most of the harm of the COVID-19 crisis has occurred because of this agenda. If you look at the third world and developing nations, they have been forced by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund over the last 40 years through structural adjustment programs, which is the fancy words for saying forcing them to privatise their public assets. And now we've got a situation where in Africa and many parts of Asia there is no public health system, and if it is there, it's almost destroyed. Fortunately in Australia, people like you and me have been involved in campaigns of the decades to ensure, to defend and extend Medicare, to defend and extend the public hospital sector, irrespective of the pain we've had to endure at the hands of those who make decisions in this country. So, we are at a crossroads. As I've been saying over the last 2 weeks, this is a moment of profound opportunity. It's a pivotal moment as far as change is concerned. So what are the major issues regarding people joining public interest before corporate interests? Well, I know there's a lot of people who support our policies, and I'll go through the policies in a minute, but the major issue seems to be this defeatism which we see in the community. You can't fight City Hall, it's all too hard, I can't cope, I'm frightened. Could you imagine if people who are involved in struggle have given up their lives over the last 150 years, struggling for a juster society, struggling for an egalitarian community, struggling for a democratic society, and I'm not talking about parliamentary elections, but a real democratic society. Could you imagine if that's the position they took? We'd still have slaves in this country. We would have exterminated all Indigenous Australians by now. I mean, to have that defeatist attitude is exactly what those who exercise power want you to believe. This is a very rich country with a minuscule population, not even 26 million people. It's an extraordinarily rich country. So what do we want? Now, we want some basic demands. The first one, which I've talked about in the past, is a universal basic income for every citizen and resident in this country. A universal basic income. And a universal basic income will cushion us as a nation and as a people from natural disasters, pandemics, wars, crises. Because in a capitalist society, the type of life you can lead is totally dependent on the amount of coins you have in your pocket and the amount of money you've got in the bank. Whether you're a social security beneficiary or an investor, it's the amount of money which determines the type of life you can lead. So we should be in a position, we are rich enough as a nation to be in a position to ensure that every resident and citizen receives a universal basic income every fortnight. Obviously, if people choose to work, and many will choose to work, that universal basic income will go back to the government in the taxation system. If you decide not to be part of the paid workforce and just do volunteer work, well, obviously you keep that universal basic income. So how do you fund it? Not like our current Treasurer is telling us that we need to increase the GST in order to recoup losses, or change the tax system and increase tax for people at the bottom end of the scale, not the top end of the scale. You do that by introducing a 1% turnover tax. Every time something is bought or sold, 1% goes directly to the Treasury. You introduce a 1% stock market turnover tax. Every time a stock or share is bought and sold, 1% goes into the Treasury. You could raise at least $400 billion every year by the imposition of taxes, which will be hardly noticed by the community. 1% is not very much. 1%. And you could actually fund a viable universal basic income. The next thing we would like to see is the nationalisation of essential services. What we've seen over the last 4 decades is electricity, gas, public hospitals to some degree, telecommunications, and the list goes on, being privatised, given away to the private sector at bargain basement prices. What the COVID-19 crisis has taught us is that we need to be able to cross-subsidise different parts of the country. It's not about every government instrumentality making a profit. It's about providing a necessary service. And the privatisation of these services has meant that when a crisis occurred, the situation is found wanting. We've even got this ridiculous situation of the privatisation of water in this country. So we would like to see essential services revert back to the state. to be controlled and owned by the people. This time, we want their ownerships incorporated in the Australian Constitution. We want a referendum put to the Australian people to incorporate the ownership of essential services into the Australian Constitution, because we don't want, the last thing we want is for some government who's got a monetary black hole selling essential services for a pittance. So if the ownership is incorporated in the Australian Constitution, the only way these essential services could be sold is through the Australian people, through a referendum agreeing to their sale. The third thing I'd like to see, or we, public interest before corporate interest, would like to see, is a reversal in our fortunes as far as the mineral and mining sector is concerned. Now, this country makes an extraordinary amount of money. Not us, not the people, not the government, but a few large multinational corporations make an extraordinary amount of money from our mineral resources. Mineral resources, you only own, even if you own property, you only own the first 8 inches. Everything else belongs to the state. It's sovereign wealth. But what we have done is we have given this wealth away to private corporations who in some cases pay a piddling little royalty, and in other cases don't even pay taxation. So we want to see, whether it's bauxite or diamonds or coal or iron ore or magnesium or copper or a silver or mineral sands or rare earth minerals, what we want to see is, if they are privately owned, 75% of profits to go directly to a wealth fund. Directly go. We want to see, is this money going to a wealth fund? If they say they can't make a profit, they can leave those resources to us and we will incorporate them in the Australian Constitution, because they do make a profit. We have billionaires in this country who don't pay tax and then big note themselves by giving away money to charities which they control and direct. So it's very important that we use this country's mineral resources for this country's First Nations people who find themselves in dire poverty, a significant proportion in dire poverty, over 230 years since colonisation began, and to the rest of the population. Why should billionaires and corporations and huge shareholdings and equity firms continue to profit from the wealth which is in this ground? It is our wealth, it is sovereign wealth, and we need to be able to control that. Now, I can talk till the cows come home, I can talk under wet cement, I can talk, in a brown paper, with a brown paper bag over my head, but I can't do this by myself. We need supporters. Public interest before corporate interest is not just a political party, it is a political movement which wants to change the cultural, social and political framework via which we live our lives, which gives more control to individuals, which entails the sharing of wealth, not the squirreling away of wealth by a few corporations and individuals. I'll give you one fact. I know facts are not very popular in 2020. People like to create their own reality. Look at Mr. Trump, 45,000 dead, and he's still talking about who knows what. Look at our own government talking about reintroducing, neoliberal concepts at the end of the COVID-19 crisis. But one fact, one simple fact, 40 years ago, if an investor invested $1 and made a profit from that dollar, 66% of that profit would go into the pockets of the people who worked to create that profit for the investor, and 34% would go into the pocket of the investor. 40 years later, the equation is reversed. For every dollar an investor invests and makes a profit, 66% goes back into the investor and 34% goes back into the workers and the people who created that profit from that investment. That's why we have a situation in Australia where home ownership has decreased, where mortgages have increased, where people live a hand-to-mouth existence, where 70% of Australians don't actually have enough money to survive a crisis in the bank for more than 4 weeks. That's why we find ourselves in this situation. That's why we see legislation passed which robs money from the poorest workers by removing their overtime payments. So we can either continue down this track and basically be slaves in this country in which we were born or which we migrated to, or we can actually be in control of our own destiny. But it does need people to be active. It needs people to protest, it needs people to bring up ideas, we need people to join public interest before corporate interest so we can register as a federal political party and actually put these ideas on the agenda. This is not a revolutionary program. This is a reformist program. You don't need constitutional change. We can use the same constitutional framework we have. We can use the parliamentary system we have to attempt to introduce these reforms. Obviously, there'll be resistance from the corporate sector, resistance from the corporate-owned media, resistance from those in authority, resistance from the major political parties. But ultimately, in any democratic society, ultimate political authority and power does not rest in the hands of the state, or the government of the day, or the armed forces, or the police, or the bureaucracy. It rests in the hands of an informed, active population. I encourage you to join us as soon as possible. You can do it in a number of ways. You can download the application form from PIBCI, PIBCI.net. You can, if you haven't got a computer, you can always send me a letter to Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. If you want 100 application forms, I'll send you 100 application forms, or you can leave a message on 0439 395 489. What they hate most of all is somebody else joining their little game without their permission. And that's what public interest before corporate interest wants to do. But we are not just solely focused on parliamentary politics. We are also focused on community boycotts and protest politics. We need your support in order to change your future, and even more importantly, the future of your children and their children. Because if we do nothing during this period, nothing will come of it. We'll just get more of the same business, which is the last thing we want. Because what this COVID-19 crisis has done, it has exposed the weakness of a capitalist system of private investment for private gain. It's exposed the weakness of an economy which is based on globalisation. I mean, fancy not even having enough face masks or protection for not just the population but health workers. Fancy not having enough ventilators. Fancy not having a manufacturing industry. It's highlighted the dangers of corporatisation with the demise of small business in this country with the COVID-19 crisis, the dangers of privatisation where we are not in a position to actually do anything, provide basic services, and the dangers of deregulation. So join PIBCI today. Don't put it off. Do it now.